Pallets, plywood, and a handful of screws. These are my 3 favorite building materials. I'm not a carpenter. I'm not an engineer. And for the people that know me, they know that I probably don't even know the definition of what precision actually is. But I know that I get this from being raised by an artist. From an early age, she taught me that turning a negative into a positive was always something that you could do. I remember when I would try to build something, let's say it was a box. I would try to build a box, and I would set out, and I had in my mind the plan of building a box, and I would just try to put this thing together, and more often than not, it wouldn't turn out to be a box. In fact, it would turn out to be something completely different. But what she would do is she would come and she would ask me, what did I build? And this would force my creativity, this would force my imagination to invent something, to see the positives in whatever I created. And then she would come, she would reinforce that, and she would compliment me on what those positives were. That's a very well-rounded box, she would say, something along those lines. So from an early age, she just gave me this unwavering self-confidence that to this day, I use in almost everything I do. Many years later, I was working in a bank. I had a very stable job, and I decided to leave that and open up my own little small coffee roasting company. The underlying philosophy of the company is that we would turn any obstacle into an opportunity, or at least we would do our best to try to solve these problems. We would need any kind of furniture or coffee gadget or anything, and what we would do is we would try to build it ourselves. And more often than not, it would actually be what we needed. Maybe not very shiny, maybe not very well polished, but it would be something functional that we planned on. However, sometimes it wasn't that. And sometimes, more interestingly, it turned out to be something completely different. And this would bring us in a whole new direction where we could just branch out and start playing with new ideas. And then 2020 happened. Before I go into that, I want to give you a picture of where I was, where the company was, and where probably thousands, possibly millions of small business owners around the world were when this pandemic hit. I had a handful of clients. These were coffee shops, restaurants, hotels, and offices. And they would buy coffee beans from us. They would rent equipment from us. We also had built a small stand, a coffee stand in a farmer's market, and on a weekly basis, we would serve coffee cups to people. We would sell them beans so that they can take them home. Also, going back to the clients, we were planning on opening 2 new cafes for clients, and there was something else that's still kind of in the pipeline, but kind of is the situation now. We were planning on taking one of the inventions that we created a long time ago that branched out, and we were in the final stages of launching this gadget, this coffee gadget, on a crowdfunding campaign to possibly sell it all around the world. When 2020 happened in March in Poland, because that's where I live, within 4 days, everything came to a crashing stop. The coffee shops, restaurants, hotels closed for obvious reasons. The offices sent their workers home to do their jobs remotely. The farmers market that we served coffee in, it closed. And so obviously the plans to open the coffee shops, those were gone. And remember, we're a small business, so opening 2 new cafes is a huge deal. Every outlet we had to make a living stopped immediately. I remember walking down the street and I was listening to a podcast from an ER doctor in the US, and they were just telling the stories about what they were experiencing, and that, along with everything else that I was hearing around the world and everything else in my world, it just brought me to tears. And for 3 days I went into a very, very dark place. But 3 days was all I could afford. So I had to snap myself out of it. I had to dig in. I had to find that creativity, that optimism that brought me to where I was before, that I got from my mother. And I had to find a solution. So I started talking to everybody. I wasn't talking to them about directly the problem of Corona, because we couldn't solve this pandemic. But what I was talking to them about was what they were doing in their new daily lives, what their routines were. I would ask them what they wished for, what they missed. And from these conversations, I was able to kind of draw a picture of what was going on within my world, because these people were in my world. I was in their world as well. And I remember one night I was talking to a couple. They own a restaurant, and they were clients of mine. They are clients of mine. And they were telling me how they would either have to close their restaurant entirely, close their business entirely, or let a bunch of their employees go, because the only option that they had to sell their product was using third-party delivery companies. These Uber Eats of the world, I'm just going to use that word, but they're in every country, there's a bunch of them. The reason why they would have to use that is because, like many businesses in the hospitality sector, in the food industry, they didn't have a system set up to deliver. They didn't have a website. They didn't have all the resources that these larger companies have. So we talked, and I remember there was the idea of creating a centralized hub where small businesses like restaurants or food producers could create products, and from this hub, everything would be distributed. Right now, these Uber Eats of the world are doing that, but with hot meals. They're doing it on an average of 30% commission, which for a restaurant, when you're already operating on a very small margin, 30% commission puts you either in a razor thin margin, or it puts you in a situation where you're selling food at a loss, because you still have to pay for insurance, you still have to pay for employees, you still have to pay for overhead, taxes, Social Security, everything. So this 30% was the only choice that they had to stay open. I went home, and for 3 days, I sat down and I typed out this business proposal, not a business plan, because I'm not very good at planning, but a business proposal that would solve the problem for myself and for a bunch of other small businesses that were in my little world. I came up with this plan, let's say a proposal, where people, restaurants, and producers could sell their products at a reasonable price, where people could people could get jobs working for the company that I was about to create and still get a fair wage. And customers would be able to support these restaurants while still enjoying all the things that they had before. However, I couldn't compete with the gorilla in the room. And the gorilla in the room was the Uber Eats of the world. I didn't have angel investors. I don't have a background in in IT developing. And I didn't have any of the resources that those people had. So I had to focus on where the problem was red hot that I could actually touch. And the problem here in Poland, in other countries it might not have existed because they already have the infrastructure set up, but the problem here in Poland was groceries. The big grocery stores did have delivery services, but when the pandemic hit, their resources were just overwhelmed, and delivery times were sometimes 2, 3, even 4 weeks from the date when you ordered. And I don't know about you, but I don't know what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, let alone 4 weeks from now. So I focused on groceries, and I started once again calling everybody that I knew. I started calling restaurants. I started calling suppliers, small companies within my world that I knew or knew of. And a lot of them were receptive. A lot of them were positive. Some of them jumped on board immediately. Some of them said no, and some of them ignored me. But I didn't care, because I already had what I felt everything I needed. I already had everything I needed to carry out this plan. So I hired somebody who wasn't a developer. I found a taxi driver that would willingly take me to the big boy city farmers market a couple times a week. I found a courier service that would make deliveries to customers, and I purchased a website domain. In 3 weeks, the worker that I had, the guy that I was working with, clocked over 200 hours. We used up almost all the resources that I had left. In the beginning, I want to say I had $300 and pallets, plywood, and a handful of screws, and a bunch of optimism. That's what I had. So we set out to do this thing, and 3 weeks later, we had a website, something that wasn't very shiny, but it worked. We went on social media, and I hit it with everything I had. I used sponsored posts. I took advantage of some of these platforms as end-of-month billing. Even though I didn't have the money, I just sponsored the hell out of everything. And I asked friends and family to share the posts, to share information on this new company. And on Wednesday, the 8th of April, we opened up the website to the public, with first deliveries going out on Friday. And by Friday morning, we had not an avalanche of deliveries, but we had enough orders to run through our entire inventory and buy basically, we ran through our entire stock that same Friday. And from there, things began. Now, that was the easy part. The easy part was putting everything together. Then we had to learn how to adapt. I had my background as coffee. For me, it's easy. You bag it or you jar it, and it's good for a month as long as it doesn't get wet. With strawberries, it's a whole different story. We had to figure out how to keep strawberries. We had to figure out how to keep spring onions, spinach, how much we should sell a customer, because a kilo of spinach is about this much spinach. 300 grams is about that much. And unlike the grocery store, we have to plan everything in advance, because a customer goes online, click, 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 and they buy. So we had to adapt to this whole new situation. That was step 2. Step 3 was something that was very interesting. We were able to create relationships with customers that we never even met. We would write them little, what I call love notes on their boxes. Sometimes a standard thank you, but more often than not, we would put a little funny comment or something. And as customers kept coming back and back, we would have a history together, and so we could exchange notes. That we would send them a letter on their box, they would send us a thank you text message or some type of post on social media or a review, and we would keep the conversations like that. People that we had never even met, we were able to create relationships with. It's been about 10 months since we started. We're still doing good. The coffee business is still alive in some ways. It's changed just like anything else. The food business, we're learning how the cycles of up and down work. But all of this came from what my mother taught me, is to turn a negative into a positive. And then what I learned later on was to use pallets, plywood, and a handful of screws to make it happen. Thank you very much.